Tina Turner was not trying to change anything. She was just humming, the way she always did before a show, quietly, almost to herself, moving through the melody the way her body moved through a warm-up, without effort, without intention, without any awareness that someone was listening. Ike Turner was listening. He heard it from across the hallway, a single melodic phrase, low and slightly syncopated, nothing like the arrangement the horn section had been rehearsing all afternoon. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Tina didn't repeat it. She moved on to something else, and the hallway went back to its usual pre-show sounds. The band tuning up in the next room, the crew adjusting stage equipment, voices calling to each other across the noise of preparation. But Ike had already stopped walking. He stood where he was for a moment, not moving, the way he always stood when something in the music had caught him before he had fully understood it. Then he turned around, went to find the horn section, and told them they were going to try something different tonight. It was the mid-1960s, and the Ike and Tina Turner Revue was a working band in the fullest sense of the word, not a name on a marquee, not a recording act that toured occasionally, but a road ensemble that played hundreds of dates a year across the American South and Midwest, in clubs and ballrooms and theaters where the audiences expected something extraordinary every time the curtain opened. The Revue had built its reputation not on records alone, but on the nightly reality of delivering a show that left rooms changed. People who had seen them once came back. People who had heard about them made a point of showing up. By this point in their career, Ike had been shaping the band for years, adding musicians, reworking arrangements, pushing the horn section into tighter coordination, building the Ikeettes into a unit that could match Tina's energy on stage without ever overshadowing her. The Revue was not yet the nationally known act it would become in the late 1960s and early 1970s, but in the circuit of clubs and theaters where they regularly performed, their name meant something specific. A show that was rehearsed to a standard most touring acts didn't attempt, performed with an energy that made the rehearsal invisible. St. Louis was the Revue's home territory in a way that nowhere else quite was, the city where Ike had built the band, where the musicians knew each other's rhythms before the first rehearsal of any given week, where the clubs were familiar enough that the stage itself felt like an extension of the rehearsal room. When the Revue played St. Louis, there was a particular expectation in the room, a specific kind of attention from audiences who believed they knew what they were about to hear and came prepared to be proven right. That familiarity cut both ways. It meant the Revue rarely had to win a St. Louis crowd from scratch. It also meant that anything less than their best was immediately visible, to the audience and to the band itself. For Ike Turner, the Revue was something he had been building and rebuilding for years, an ensemble that he shaped not just through rehearsal and arrangement, but through a constant, restless attention to what the music was doing at any given moment. He listened the way a carpenter listens to wood, for the grain, for the place where the material wants to go rather than where the plan says it should. He had an ear for the gap between what was rehearsed and what was possible, and when something crossed that gap, he noticed it, even when the person responsible hadn't noticed it themselves. Tina was, in this sense, his most unpredictable instrument, not in the way that word sometimes implied, not as a problem to manage, but in the way that a voice capable of something unexpected is always going to exceed what is written for it. She had been performing with the Revue long enough that her role in it was thoroughly established. The arrangements were built around her, the band knew her timing, and the Ikeettes had learned to follow her instincts, even when those instincts ran slightly ahead of the rehearsed choreography. But there were still moments, usually off stage, when Tina's voice did something that no arrangement had asked for and no rehearsal had anticipated. This was one of those moments. The afternoon had gone the way most pre-show afternoons went with the Revue. The horn section had run through the opening number twice, then the full set list in sequence, then the sections that Ike flagged for tightening. He stopped the band 3 times, once for a horn entry he felt was landing half a beat behind where it needed to be, once for a transition that wasn't as clean as the night before, wants to run through the final numbers build from the top. By the time the rehearsal ended, the band was warm and settled, not loose, never loose, but running at the kind of steady, reliable temperature that meant the show was ready. Tina had done her own preparation separately, the way she usually did. Vocal runs, movement, the private ritual of getting her body and voice into the state they needed to be in before a show. It was a ritual she had developed over years of performing, not a fixed sequence of exercises so much as a gradual arrival, a process of closing off the parts of her attention that weren't needed on stage and opening the parts that were. By the time the band had finished, she was already dressed, already focused, already somewhere in the mental space between preparation and performance, where she spent the last hour before every curtain. The hallway between the dressing room and the stage entrance was narrow, and people passed through it constantly in the final hour. Crew members, band members heading outside and back, the Ikettes checking in with each other before their own warm-up. It was not a quiet hallway. But the sounds of the hallway had a texture that everyone in the revue had learned to hear through, familiar enough to become background noise, the sonic equivalent of peripheral vision. It was into this background that Tina's hum appeared briefly and disappeared. She was standing near the door when it happened, not performing the sound so much as letting it pass through her, the way singers sometimes do when the voice is warm and the mind is elsewhere. When a melody surfaces not because it was called for, but because the instrument is simply running. The phrase she hummed was low in her register, slightly behind the beat as she moved through it, and it sat differently against the underlying groove of the song than the arrangement the horns had been rehearsing. It wasn't an improvement exactly. It wasn't a correction, wasn't a suggestion. It was a variation, accidental, lasting 4 seconds, already gone. Ike heard it. He came to find the horn section with the focused, quiet energy he always carried when something had already been decided in his mind. He didn't explain at length. He sang the phrase, close to what Tina had hummed, transposed for the horns, reshaped slightly so it would sit where he needed it to sit in the arrangement, and asked if they had it. They did. He ran through the transition twice with them, the place where the new phrase would enter, and the place where the existing chart would pick back up. And then it was done. The band absorbed the change the way they absorbed most of Ike's last-minute decisions, without ceremony, with the efficiency of musicians who had learned that the fastest path through a late change was simply to learn it and trust that the rest would follow. Some of the horn players exchanged looks, not alarm, but the particular alertness that came with any last-minute alteration, the awareness that there would be no additional run-through, that the first time they played the new phrase in full context would be in front of an audience. They had been in this position before. It was not comfortable, and it was not supposed to be. Discomfort, in Ike's experience, kept the band listening, kept them playing toward each other, rather than relying on muscle memory alone. Tina, for her part, did not know what Ike had done. She had been elsewhere in the final preparations, and by the time the band moved to their positions, there was no moment to pull her aside and explain the change. What she knew was what she always knew going into a show with the Revue, that the arrangement was the arrangement until Ike decided it wasn't, and that the job, always, was to follow the band into whatever the night actually became. When the horn phrase arrived, roughly 4 minutes into the set, Tina heard it the way you hear something that sounds almost familiar before it fully registers. A phrase close to the melody she knew, but sitting differently, landing on the beat from a slightly different angle. She didn't miss a step. Her body made the adjustment before her mind had fully processed what was different, the way a singer who has performed a song hundreds of times adjusts to a slight tempo shift without consciously deciding to. The phrase moved through her, and she moved with it, and for a moment the song opened in a direction it had never opened before. The audience felt it without knowing why. The room shifted in that particular way rooms shift when something unexpected arrives inside something familiar, not the sharp attention of surprise, but the softer recognition that something is different, that the performance has found a room inside the song that nobody had walked into before. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of thing that stopped the show or drew applause for itself. It was the kind of thing that made people lean slightly forward without quite knowing they had done it. The band held the new phrase, moved back into the existing arrangement, and the song continued. The Ikettes, who had also not been told, adjusted in real time the way they always adjusted, watching Tina, matching her energy, their choreography finding the new shape of the music without breaking formation. By the time the number ended, the change had been absorbed so completely that the new arrangement already felt like the only one the song had ever had. Afterward, backstage, Ike said very little about what had happened. He acknowledged the horn section briefly, a nod, the kind of acknowledgement that in the review carried more weight than a longer statement would have. The band understood what the nod meant. The change had landed, the experiment had worked, the risk had been worth taking. What the evening had revealed, quietly, was something that people who worked closely with Ike already understood, that his authority over the revue's sound was not simply the authority of discipline and rehearsal, though those were real. It was also the authority of someone who never fully stopped listening, not during rehearsal, not during the show, not in the hallway an hour before the curtain. The music for Ike did not exist only on the stage. It existed in every space where the band moved through their preparations, and he was always quietly paying attention. Tina found out what had happened in the way she often found out about changes Ike had made, indirectly, through a comment from one of the horn players about the new phrase, an offhand mention of when Ike had written it. She was not surprised. She had learned over years of performing with the Revue that the distance between her own instincts and Ike's ear was sometimes smaller than she realized. The things she did without thinking, sounds she made between songs or before shows, occasionally found their way back to her in a form she didn't recognize until it was already part of the arrangement. It was a strange kind of creative relationship to exist inside, one where the exchange was rarely direct, rarely acknowledged, rarely framed as collaboration in the way that word usually implies. Tina did not think of herself as contributing to the arrangements. Ike did not describe what he did as borrowing from her. And yet the hum became the phrase became the arrangement, and the arrangement became the night. What remained of that evening, in the years that followed, was not any single detail anyone could point to, not a recording, not a set list with the new chart written in the margin, not a specific account of which song the change appeared in. What remained was the shape of it, held by the musicians who had been in that hallway and on that stage, the few seconds of warning, the new chart arriving with no ceremony, and the moment on stage when a phrase Tina had hummed without intention became something the room actually heard. It was the kind of thing that happened in different forms across years of performing with the Revue, the kind of thing that made the band what it was. Not the rehearsed precision alone, though that precision was real and hard-won. Not the arrangements alone, though those arrangements were built with genuine skill and constant attention. But the capacity, cultivated over years of nightly performance, to take something accidental and make it deliberate, to hear 4 seconds of unconscious melody in a hallway and know, before it had finished, exactly where it needed to go. That was what happened on that particular night in St. Louis. And that was why, in the memory of the people who were there, the show that followed felt like something the band had been building toward for years, even though the most important part of it had only been written an hour before.